My name is Jen Buchholz. I'm a forensics and criminal justice professor at American Military University, an Army veteran, and a criminal investigator for my local sheriff's department.
I'm George Jared. I'm an investigative journalist and award-winning true crime author.
Together, George and I are the lead investigators for AMU's Cold Case Investigative Team. This season, we're working to break the case for the family of Linda Malcom. This podcast contains details and descriptions of actual homicide victims and their injuries, including sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. Previously on Break the Case.
I'm Detective Walton with Port Orchard Police Department. I am the detective assigned to the case of Linda Malcom. I've been working on her case since the summer of 2022. I definitely believe that the killer, or at least someone who knows what happened, is still out there. The fire seemed neat and tidy and methodical, so that would indicate to me that either the killer or someone else had some time afterwards to try and come up with a way to make it seem like an accident and try to distance themselves from her murder.
I recently went through training to become certified in investigative genetic genealogy, also known as IgG for short. This investigative tactic is used when law enforcement has a DNA profile collected from a crime scene, but doesn't know who it belongs to. Using open source public ancestry databases, genealogists can build a family tree that identifies the likely suspect, or at least a family surname. Since this tactic is being used in Linda's case, George and I decided to bring my instructor, Christine Burke, on the podcast to explain the process in more detail. Christine founded the company Genetic Genealogy for law enforcement. Welcome back, everybody, to Break the Case. I'm in studio today with two amazing people, one being my investigative partner, George Jared. Hey, George.
What's up?
And the other one is my instructor from the investigative genetic genealogy course I took, Christine Burke. Hi, Christine.
Hey, how are you?
Good. I'm so glad that you were willing to join us today because your expertise is directly applicable to the case that our team is working on right now. So I think listeners are going to be really interested to hear from you. To get started, would you mind just telling us your background? How did you get into the genealogy stuff?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to hopefully impart some information on the case you're working and also just have an opportunity to talk about what I do and the need. We just have so many things that need so much help, and getting the exposure and getting the word out there is really great.
Definitely.
So thank you. Well, I kind of have a funny story, I guess you could say. I started out a very long time ago as a police officer. I was a police officer, detective, and then a sergeant, and I left law enforcement and went into the corporate world, found that was not engaging or interesting or satisfying my personal need to give back, why I got into law enforcement in the first place. And I started my own investigations agency, and my life was just humming along fine until 2017 when I found out I wasn't who I thought I was, and my dad was not my dad. And neither was my mom's. So I lost 75% of my family.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy. I'm still not totally recovered. I describe it as I have this huge hole in myself. Like, you don't really think about your identity until you lose it. And
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah, it's very hard to describe. I was speaking at a local genealogy group, and there was a gentleman there. And he had found out he was adopted late in life. And he was very candid with me that he very seriously was wanting to end his life because he couldn't deal with it. And that just really struck home. So he understood what I was talking about. Thank goodness it was a little easier for me. But the challenging part was, how do I fix this? How do I find out who I am? And being an investigator, it was very challenging. I should be able to solve this. I should be able to know it right away. And I didn't. As you know, in law enforcement, we just have to do what we have to do. And I set out and learned everything. For several years, I would stomp my foot and say, God, why did you do this to me? I was going through the stages of grief and all that. And then one day, like an epiphany, I just said, oh, why not me? Because of my background. And I said, okay, I'm going to train the police how to do this and how to find people.
Wow.
And so that's what I do today. They don't currently have a lot of resources, as you know. And so I set about training and working on cases to help these folks. And that's where I've been. I started in 2021 and here I am.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So with your own journey, that's how you got started with the genealogy type stuff and the family history research?
Yeah. So genetic genealogy combines genealogy, which is the records, right? The family histories that we pass down. And genealogy has been done since the beginning of time. And then when we add the genetics to it, we're verifying the records because the records are not always right, which brings up another thing as police officers. We think of legal records, birth certificates, things like that as legal documents, and they're right. Well, guess what? DNA reveals, no, they're not.
Not always.
I never had the desire, okay, I want to be this genetic genealogist. I really didn't have any interest because I thought I knew who I was. My mom and I had been around the world and visited where everybody came from, and I thought everything was fine. And then it wasn't. And so I had this quest.
I am just curious, how did you find out that the father you thought was your father was not? Was it through DNA?
I thought I was a Burke in my case. So my dad was never involved in my life, and he died at some point. So when I was looking for Burkes and things like that, I just thought they were people in my family that I didn't know because in my life, I only knew my mom's family. And it was just me as a child. I just thought they're like related to me somehow. And it was only when my cousin on my mom's side were having a conversation, and she said, oh, by the way, we took an ancestry test and da-da-da-da-da. And I said, oh, okay. And then all of a sudden it popped up in my results, and my aunt showed as my cousin. And I was like, that's not right. And so I called my cousin. I'm like, is there something going on? Because my grandmother had her first daughter, which is my cousin's mom, when she was really young. So I'm like, is there something I don't know? And she's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, it's not right. It's same cousin. She goes, that test is just wrong.
Okay.
The test is just wrong. Of course she's your aunt. I'm like, okay. And that's when I started nosing around, and a lot of people blame the test. And no, the DNA is always right. The DNA will always tell you.
Yeah.
So that led me on the path to find out that my mom's dad was not her dad. And then I kid you not, I have this visual in my head. I sat up in bed one night and I said, oh my goodness, Burke's not my dad.
It just came to you.
Yeah, because it would have never been a consideration in my head that people aren't who they think they are. Like, what are you talking about? But then I sat up in bed and then I went in the matches and there wasn't a Burke in there. I even called the people from FTDNA and I'm like, I'm not seeing anything here. You know, am I right or am I wrong? And they were like, well, that's a good point there. And, you know, that started my quest. But it should be very evident. If you're seeing people you don't know and you're not seeing people you do know, that's a problem.
Something has gone astray.
Right.
And so when you talk about matches, can you explain what that term means?
Well, it kind of looks like email. So you log into a portal and they come in and they're all listed in the range of closest match to lowest match. And this is one of the things that when I first had seen my results, when I didn't know that there was a problem, because I didn't pay attention to the centimorgans. And that's the measurement of DNA, right? So when we see these matches, they list, and I call this the politically correct relationship, okay? So instead of it telling me that my aunt was my half aunt, it said first cousin. So it comes up in a list and you basically measure it by the amount of DNA that you share with a person. And that's how you figure it out.
To clarify, the term match refers to another person who shares a portion of DNA in common with you. No two people will have a 100% match because no two people's DNA are exactly the same. Even identical twins can now be differentiated between. Centimorgans are the measurement tool used to compare the percentage of DNA two people share in common. The higher the centimorgan number, the more DNA the two people share, and the closer relatives they are to each other.
Christine, have you been able to figure out who your father is? And wouldn't it be easier if maybe your mom just told you?
Well, what we run into in a lot of biological cases, and it is just what it is, things happen, okay? And we have moms that sometimes don't own up to what happened, or don't know what happened. And my mom at the time was actually in the throes of Alzheimer's and dementia, so I could not ask her.
Gotcha.
But I was also supposedly born premature. So we know that was not correct. So I have two candidates, but based on record keeping, our grandparents were like really up to some stuff, okay? And also back then, there's not a lot of records necessarily, right? There's family secrets and skeletons in the closet, no pun intended. And so I have a really good idea, but the two candidates are dead and the living family is not cooperative. So I know what the science tells me. So I know I have my candidates and I know who my paternal grandfather is.
Wow. You've been through quite the journey, I have to say.
Yes, I have.
And a difficult one.
Yeah.
And I bet there's a lot of people out there that can relate too. It's like you gave the other example of the gentleman you met who'd been through a similar situation.
Yeah. And if I can say anything for your listeners, if you can help at all, if you've taken a test and you can help anybody, please consider helping, because the children didn't do this. We just want to know who they are. So that's my PSA for that.
When I was researching for this episode and an article I wrote, I was trying to figure out like how many cases have actually been solved because of investigative genetic genealogy. And the stat I found that I think is pretty official said 651 at the end of February 2024. I mean, that's significant to me. That's 650 cases that 5 years ago people thought had no hope. So the more people that become proficient in what you do, the more cases inevitably I think we're going to solve.
Well, and I totally appreciate that number, but there's over 16,400 unidentified human remains cases across the United States.
Yes.
So that number is just a drop in the bucket. That is not enough to handle the current cold case backlog problem. And that's not even counting the new cases that we can handle and solve today. I foresee this as coming in like going to be the new standard, right? Speaking as the former cop, the investigator, this is a tool in the police toolkit, whether it's done by a civilian, or it's done by a detective. But we've got a long ways to go.
Yeah, we're still drowning. I agree.
That's a good analogy, yes.
I refer to it as a national crisis.
It is.
Yeah.
I tell it people all the time. I said, do you know how many cases there are? And they're shocked. I do a podcast to try to raise awareness. It's called Unknown Humans Remain. And I just try to give a little bit of info and get people involved, because all these people are people's mother, father, brother, sister. And some of the cases are either over or close to 100 years old that these poor people have just been left with no dignity and no proper rest.
So, Christine, for a layman like me, could you just describe the process of how investigative genetic genealogy is used in solving a homicide?
Yes. So you've got DNA from the crime scene. It's been through CODIS. You don't have a hit.
As a reminder for listeners, CODIS is the FBI's database that houses DNA profiles from convicted felons. If an investigator identifies a DNA profile from a crime scene, they can upload it to CODIS to see if it matches anyone in the database. In many cases, however, there is no match and the DNA sample is unidentified.
So what we do is we take it and we send it off to a lab, and they extract what I like to call the blueprint. It's called a genome. And the way I give the analogy is like when you're building a house, you have an architect build a blueprint, and it talks about how the house is going to be constructed and what it's going to look like and what the exterior, right? So they extract the genome, and we have the capability that we can look at what the person is going to look like, all right? Once we get the genome back, we get a list of matches, and we start looking at the matches and figuring out who those people are, those biological relatives to the suspect, or in the case of the unknown humans remain, who that person is. Traditionally, the old methods of investigation, and you still do it, you do what's called a neighborhood canvass. You shake the trees, so to speak, and you get the public to give you potential suspects, gives you leads and stuff like this. In genetic genealogy, we do the same thing, but we're doing it through the biological relatives are giving us the clues and giving us the leads. And then we measure the relationship and we figure out who the person is.
Now, Christine, when you say that you're able to track, if you get a blueprint, is there like a database that's full of these other people's blueprints that you're able to compare and contrast to? How does that part work?
Our genetic information is encoded in chromosomes, which makes up our genome. And we are made up of little bits and pieces of all our ancestors, okay? And all those little bits and pieces of genetic material reside on our chromosomes. And so when we put our genome, our little chromosome set into the computer, it goes around and looks for matches with our relatives because we're going to share bits of DNA with related people because we share the same ancestor. Centimorgans is how you measure it. That's going to describe a relationship. So it's going to say grandparent or whatever. And then when you figure out who those people are and you understand the distance in the relationship, you can tell who that person is. In genetic genealogy, we're basically going out and investigating and asking questions through the DNA. Who do you know? Who does this sound like? And the DNA is pushing you towards that person.
When a crime is committed, clues live within digital devices. That's digital forensics. Learn how to process and analyze that data by earning a Bachelor's of Science in Digital Forensics from American Military University. Classes are online with monthly program starts. Learn more about AMU's digital forensics degree by visiting amuonline.com/forensics.
We'll just use an example, the case we're working on right now, Linda Malcom. We have an unknown source of DNA that was at the crime scene that they're going to have to process. And they're going to use genetic genealogy to figure out who's related to this person. How do you get the DNA from the people they're related to? How do you get their blueprints so that you can make this comparison? Like, if the person's unknown, how do you know who to go after their DNA to see if they're related to them?
So they've submitted their information to a database, okay? When I took my ancestry test and found out I wasn't who I was, I found that out through the comparison of people in the database that had also put them in there, right? So we never look at their genome or anything like that. They just pop up with the amount of matches and say, hey, this part matches your part, or in the case of the unknown subject, they're going to be a person that you want to find out and build out their family, which is then in turn going to lead you to your suspect's family or your unknown human remains. I like to call it the person of interest.
Okay. And so is there an actual name for this database that's used?
Yeah, for law enforcement, currently, we use Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch.
Excellent.
And those are the only ones that, with their terms of service, allow law enforcement access.
Yeah, and with the terms of service, George, so if you do one of these at-home kits and you upload it to FTDNA or GEDmatch, in the terms of service, you have to opt in order to allow law enforcement to use this coded version of your genome to make comparisons. So if a user does not opt in, they can still be in that database, but law enforcement will not have any access to their centimorgans.
Gotcha.
I know confidentiality comes up a lot, and I actually wrote an article on this 3-4 years ago, and I wrote another one recently because they still have, even my own brother, he goes, I don't want law enforcement to have my DNA. I'm not uploading it. I'm like, they're never going to have your DNA. That's not how it works.
Well, and you raise a good point. And if I could do another little PSA here, if folks want to help and get involved, not everybody can be a police officer, but if someone has taken a DNA test at one of the big three and would consider moving that file over to FTDNA or GEDmatch, that would help because it helps build our population. Obviously, if we could get into Ancestry, that would be great, or 23andMe. But right now we can't. So if they would move their DNA over there, obviously they've got to opt in. That would be a huge help because the more people, the more matches, the easier and the quicker it makes the work. But to your point, Jen, even myself as a civilian, I have the option to be matched with other regular civilian users or not, right? So if you want to find out, you as a civilian regular person want to find out who you are, you've got to participate in that to be able to be matched by the computer to the other people. And that's kind of the same process on the law enforcement end. And we don't see any of their genome or any of that, but it's their choice, which they can withdraw at any time.
My understanding, when you take an at-home test and you mail it in, yes, you did swab your cheek and actually get your DNA, but it's converted into a coded version. and the original has to be destroyed by whatever company you use to do that. So it's just a coded version. It is a bunch of gobbledygook.
Right.
If you just saw it on a piece of paper somewhere lying in the street, it would mean absolutely nothing. And that's what's being uploaded into these databases. It's just a coded version. So even if law enforcement uses your DNA to help identify a person of interest, they don't actually have access to your DNA. So it's not like, oh, they could take my DNA and plant it at a crime scene. No. And they can't put it in CODIS. It would be useless. It's a coded version. It wouldn't work for CODIS. It's not being sold to health insurance companies to see like what health problems you might have. None of that is possible. I'm always preaching about this to try to put people's minds at ease so that they'll participate.
Yeah, we really need more education on this.
Totally. Yeah. So in terms of Linda's case, Linda was killed in 2008. So DNA was a thing back then, but has come a long way in the 16 years since. I don't know when they discovered this unknown DNA profile at the crime scene, whether they've had it all along or whether it came out of the new testing they did last year. But either way, they have an unknown sample. We don't know the type of DNA. Like, we don't know if it's blood or semen or saliva or whatever. And we don't know where in the house or on her it was found. Not sure. To us, it would be interesting to know. It doesn't matter. The police clearly think that it could be relevant because they've gone to great lengths to get grants and stuff for the testing and the genetic genealogy. But what George and I were recently informed by them is that they have started reaching out to people they believe share a portion of DNA in common with either the matches that came back or possibly the person of interest. And there's at least one person who refused to cooperate and provide a DNA sample for a comparison. And that was heartbreaking. Obviously, there are other ancestors out there who are still alive that they're going to contact. But Christine, if you could talk to that person directly who got the phone call from police and refused, what would you like to say to reassure them that it's a safe, confidential process?
Not being involved in the case, I don't know how close that relative could be or what their history is, right? I'm assuming this is what they're going to call a reference sample. I'm very particular on doing reference samples, but the best thing that I could say to anybody is I'm always happy to help educate somebody instead of you verbally speaking, the DNA speaking for you. And if they're coming to you for a reference sample, you're probably not the suspect.
No.
Okay?
We know that.
Right? But it can be scary.
Yes.
And so get education and try to understand what is really involved in the process, but you could really, really help. Hopefully, even though they have that refusal, they've built enough and worked the rest of the matches that won't matter.
Yeah, I know they've gotten a partial family tree so far. We're not privy to any of that, and that's fine. It sounds to me like maybe a portion of that tree they're not having a lot of success figuring out. And so by getting a couple reference samples might help them fill that out better.
Yeah, so if you're hitting a wall in a tree, either you have identified the wrong person in your tree, you've built your tree improperly as the investigator, or the person doesn't know who they are. And you have to be able to recognize when that happens and then pivot.
Christine, using this methodology, I know you've been involved in a bunch of cases, but do you have like an example of maybe one case where you were able to use investigative genetic genealogy to solve a case?
Well, my favorite one right now, and I can't talk a lot about them, but my favorite one right now was in a human remains case. And a gentleman went missing in 1992 and disappeared. His bones were actually recovered in 2020, and they didn't know who he was. We actually worked through the case with the detectives. I was putting on the class for them, and we were able to identify him in 48 hours.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, wow.
And bring closure to his family.
That's incredible.
I'm hardcore.
Yeah, you are. Did you sleep during those 48 hours or?
I've been working 12-hour days on the case that I'm on because I'm really close, and I can't help myself because
For sure. Yeah.
it's a human at the other end of it, a victim or whatever.
I bet. It's such a great feeling. So how does the process hold up in court? I mean, now we know now that we have case precedents, but is there anything you want to talk about from the legal side in court that you've witnessed?
This is lead generation, It's the same old police work we've been doing since the beginning of time. It's lead generation. And just like any police investigation, I prepare my cases and I teach my folks that you need to be prepared to go in and defend it in court, right? And you just do a good case and you do it right, just like you put any attention to any one of the cases. This is just another investigative method. And the DNA is the DNA. It's no different from CODIS. If they make a good identification, the DNA is going to be the DNA, right? They're going to make the match, right? So after you develop your person of interest or whoever you think it is, they go out, they have to test it.
Yes.
Right? They're not just going to take your word off of it, off the tree.
Yeah.
Again, normal police work. Then do you decide, do you do surreptitious? Or do you get a search warrant, or what do you do? But the DNA is ultimately the DNA. It's going to be a one-to-one match, okay? Mm-hmm. So to me, there's no disputing that. So you should be able to defend that in court, right? The question may come in about how the investigation was conducted.
Yeah, and I'll say I don't believe there's any jurisdiction in the U.S. where the district attorney's office would have the judge sign an arrest warrant based only off the findings of the genetic genealogy process. Even if the DNA matched, they would need more. They would need to be able to place that person in the area or show a relationship to the victim or, cell phone records, something else. They can't just say, well, we built this family tree and your DNA matches the person, like your blood was found at the crime scene, it's you. No.
Right. Well,
there has to be a lot more to it to bring a case to court. This is just one piece of the puzzle.
Well, we're still talking about probable cause, right?
Yes.
So regular police work doesn't go out the window, right? And probable cause comes into play, right? You got to back it up with the other evidence. And that's what the probable cause, we put all those elements together and bring it forward.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know of any judge anywhere in the country that would even sign off if it was just genetic genealogy.
No.
There's no way.
I don't think so.
I don't think a cop wants to do that either, right? Like, you're not going to risk your career on that, right? We want to be certain.
Yes.
Well, yeah, and you don't want to put the wrong person in jail.
Absolutely.
Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah, for sure. So is there anything new up and coming in this field, Christine? Is there any new developments coming about or advancements that you foresee in the near future with regards to the genetic genealogy field?
Well, I feel like we're behind the eight ball a lot because we need some law enforcement labs that are capable of producing the genome and doing this lab work. That's a whole nother episode about funding and resources and all that stuff. But I've been in talks with Ancestry and doing some things about how AI could help in the matching or making those matches faster or help us professionally. I think the work is solid. We just need to raise awareness. Now, here's another thing too. When I go out and I speak to people and I tell them what I do, the majority of people think that police departments already do this. They're like, the CSI factor. They're like, they're not already doing that? I'm like, no. Right? So we've got some leaps and bounds to come. The technology is totally there. We just need to embrace it a little quicker.
Yeah, and it would be great if there were more, I'll call them like in-house investigators, I guess, who are employed by a law enforcement agency that have the skill to do this.
That's my mission.
Yep, instead of having to seek out grant money and then you have an outside company that has nothing to do with the case and then confidentiality issues could be argued in terms of that. So I know that was part of my goal in taking your class is to be the in-house person for not only my own department, but I'm hoping they could offer me up to the Colorado Springs Police Department or surrounding departments. I mean, we can all help each other out and I would have no issue with it. So
that's awesome. That's awesome.
That's something I'd like to see as well.
Me too. Yes.
Yeah. So tell us about your business, your courses, like who do you cater to? How can people find out more about you and get on board with your training if they want to?
So as I mentioned, my mission is for everybody to have this, right? I want every case to be solved. I know that's a little daunting, but I'm going to go for it. I've come full circle kind of in my passion from when I first started out. I started out in law enforcement when I was very young and I train the civilians, right? So I have a certificate program that I train civilians and there's no requirements. I don't want there to be a barrier to entry for anybody that wants to help anybody. So I have a civilian program. It's a certificate program. And I teach law enforcement, the class that you went through. Mm-hmm. And I also provide services. So police agencies can reach out to me and One of the things, kind of like you talked about, is how expensive it is.
Yes.
And I price shop. So I will help an agency. I'll price shop depending on the type of extraction that they need or the testing that they need. I'll help them with that. And then depending on what we have for resources, we try to do as many cases as we can for free, but we do charge, and we just try to help out wherever we can. I just want to solve whatever I can, however I can do it. And if they'd like more information, you want me to give the website?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, it's genetic, Genetic, genealogy, Genealogy, forensic, FORENSIC, services.com.
Great.
I'm not sure if you're aware, I try to raise money, right? So I can give back. I also have a program called Enduring Service where an agency, if they've lost a hero or heroine in the line of duty, I give them a free class. But I wrote a series of books. I was like, how can I raise more money, right? Because funding is the issue.
Yes.
And so I have a series right now. I have 4 books, and basically the characters mirror my life and how I go through and I do these genetic genealogy investigations. And they can find those books. My Unknown Humans podcast is on YouTube.
Wonderful.
And then the books, they can go to shop, SHOP, ponytail, PONYTALE, publishing.com.
Fantastic. Is it a series? Like, do all 4 books relate to each other, or are they all just separate?
No, well, the characters, they each solve a case, right? So there's a case each book.
Oh, I love it.
What I've done is I take the details of a real unknown human remains case that is actually unsolved, and then I fictionalize it and I solve it. But it'll walk through my mind, and I write them from the standpoint of how I would solve it.
That's incredible.
Thank you.
Well, you and George have a major thing in common because you're both authors of several books.
Oh, very cool. Okay.
Yep. My last book, Jennifer co-wrote with me. It was about our investigation into the Deborah Sue Williamson murder in Lubbock, Texas in 1975. I would literally do anything if we had just one piece of DNA in that case.
I know.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay, that's going on my list.
Yeah, and we're working on another one now, actually, on the case out of Arkansas that I told you in the beginning where the guy is now in prison. That is a crazy, twisted tale.
Oh.
You almost wouldn't believe it.
I've told people for years, I've written about dozens and dozens and dozens of murder cases. And Jen, I told you this when we first started talking over 5 years ago. There was nothing to Rebecca's case. She was basically bonked on the head. There was no evidence of sexual assault, and she was left on the side of the road. And the way that case evolved is, Christine, you couldn't even believe it. It is the most insane case maybe ever.
Well, they say the truth is stranger than fiction, right?
For sure.
Wow, that's awesome.
Oh, yeah.
The bizarre part is the killer was in our Facebook group dedicated to this victim, communicating with us.
Oh, they like lurking and stuff. Mm-hmm.
Christine, if there were 1 or 2 things that you could do, I'm talking like changes within the investigative genealogy dynamic, what are some specific things that you would like to see as far as like changes moving forward in this field?
I would like more people to get educated. I would like more people to put their DNA in the FTDNA, in the GEDmatch database. That would help us immensely. I would like people to get educated so that they could talk to their legislators and overcome these privacy barriers that are coming up, and raise awareness, not that they should pester law enforcement, but say, hey, are you using this? And if not, how can we help you? And kind of join the movement so that we can get them to do it, so we can clear up these cases, right? And maybe if they feel a desire to take a class or something like that, right? So we've got a lot of prohibitive legislation that's coming down. We've got a lot of folks that are just uneducated, and we just need more participation so that we can make it more accessible.
So, Christine, what you're saying is if you guys had enough genetic samples in the database, any law enforcement agency in the United States, if any of them have the DNA of a killer, that if you had enough of that stuff in a database, you could figure out who that person was.
Yeah, and it doesn't even need to be the killer. We just need closer matches, right? We need higher matches. GEDmatch and FTDNA are not, quote, the popular databases so much. So the more people we can get over there, the higher the match, the easier it is to identify the family.
Excellent.
I got one more question.
Okay.
It's a yes, no. Port Orchard Police Department is the department that has jurisdiction over Linda Malcolm's case. My understanding is they've hired DNA Labs International to do the testing and genetic genealogy. If DNA Labs International was willing to share with you what they've put together so far, would you be willing to consult with them and help them?
All day, any day.
I figured that's what you would say.
Well, Jen, sounds like we need to make a phone call.
Christine, it has been such a pleasure for you to join me and George today. We can't thank you enough. We've talked for the last several weeks how excited we were about having you educate our listeners on this process. So just from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. And also, for people who are interested in Christine's class, I took it. I'm not going to lie, it was hard. It worked my brain. But I enjoyed it so much. I thought you made it just so easy to understand how this process works. And the exercises that you gave us for homework were perfect. If you can get through those, you can do this. And so I would highly recommend your class to anybody out there who's interested.
Well, thank you. I really, really appreciate it. And I was excited too, because we all just need to band together, and I'm appreciative of what you guys are doing to raise awareness. So we'll all just eventually get it done. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I expect that we will stay in touch in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, you may live to regret that, but we will be staying in touch.
Yeah, you might regret that I took your class.
No, I love it. I love it.
Thank you to you both. Have a wonderful weekend. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by American Military University. Narrated and produced by Jen Buchholz with co-host and investigative journalist George Jared. Senior producers Leishan Kranick, Andy Crow, and Kristen Kretzler. Sound engineering and editing by Harvest Creative Services. Subscribe to Break the Case on iHeartRadio, Google, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.